everyone, I'm Patty First. I am a founding principal here at the Raben Group. We are a nationwide public affairs firm rooted in progressive values. I'm so happy to be here today with Juliette Kayyem, my longtime friend from our days in the Clinton administration. Juliette's amazing. She is currently the senior Belfer lecturer in international security at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where she's the faculty chair of the Homeland Security and Security and Global Health projects. She's the author of Security Mom, which is a great book that you should read. It's a memoir that explores the intersection and the commonalities of her life in Homeland Security and her life as a mother. She's also the founder of Kayyem Solutions, LLC, which provides strategic advice in resiliency planning, risk management, mega event security, infrastructure protection, and cybersecurity. She's held senior positions in the Obama and Clinton administrations and with Governor Patrick in Massachusetts. Welcome, Juliette.
Patty, thanks for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Yeah, we're thrilled to have you. We're thrilled to have you. So we're talking today about work and kind of the future of work. And, you know, we're now 6 months in to COVID-19, the pandemic, unbelievably. And it kind of feels like we're entering a new phase. Like for the first 2 months, we were really kind of rapidly and radically changing our lives. And many people abruptly lost jobs, some of which they haven't gotten back. Others adjusted to working from home, to leading our kids through virtual learning, and also to knowing very little about COVID at that time, so that everything seemed like a potential threat. And then over the summer, felt like we entered a little bit of a new phase where we were kind of starting to adjust a bit. We didn't have the pressure of online school. We started to get the hang a little bit of working from home, and now it's fall and school's back. And working from home kind of is entering this new phase, it feels like, where the pace has picked up, the work has picked up, and a heck of a lot of people are still out of work. And we know a whole lot more about what's safe and what's not. So you call this time the now normal instead of the new normal. Can you just tell us what you mean by that phrase?
No, it is. It's a phrase. Actually, it comes from my friend who's a minister who was trying to ground his congregation in March, which was essentially the idea of a new normal is that we're going to get somewhere, and it is going to be the place that we are. So you think about pre 9/11 and then post 9/11. The now normal in my world then describes the period that we're in until further notice, right? So I'm putting this in quotes now. The period that we're in that is essentially, adaptive every day. So exactly what you said, Patty, that we have learned a lot. People, I sort of give people sort of, the cruel reality of where we are. But the good news is we have learned a lot. We know what the virus wants, and so to speak, and we know ways in which we can mitigate its damage, which is great. And that we are, but we are entering a stage in which we will learn to adapt, live with, dance around, pivot around, whatever the verb is, the virus. And that is going to be different every day based on a couple of things. I mean, one is just going to be, just general, is it in my community? What's the community spread? Do I still have a job or don't I? But a huge part of it, and this is what I reflected on in a recent piece for The Atlantic, is our risk calculation, personal, will change because the runway has gotten longer. So things I was unwilling to do, and because we know more. So things that I was unwilling to do in March and April, well, now that it's September, I'm looking at a miserable winter. We did not get our numbers down enough. Flu season, we're going inside, windows are closed, all the things that we don't want in terms of trying to manage COVID. And now my risk calculation is different because the downsides are cumulative, right? In other words, your kids are home for 2 months. That's okay. Like what you said, like, April, May, we were on adrenaline. We can deal with it. Summer, they're outside or they're on TV, but we can deal with it. Now you're like 9 freaking months of this, right? So, so that's sort of
more.
Yeah, more. So every day, right, is going to be different. And there are people who, are suffering economically. There are people who are suffering mentally. And then there are just, as I readily admit, my complaints are ones of convenience, not necessity, but it's still hard. It's still hard as a working mother.
Right, right. I love that term you used, adaptability.
Yeah.
That feels so important right now.
Yeah.
And when we think about reopening,
yeah,
and adaptability, those two things seem to clash a little bit, right? So what do you advise companies as they're considering reopening? And I think you have a slide about this.
I do have a slide, and I think that's great because I do. So, in the public political discourse, right? We get into this open, close, the economy, the virus, schools open, schools close, as if that's like, binary and national. Like, it's just ridiculous. Obviously, if you're in Florida, you're a very different calculation than if you're in Massachusetts, because our numbers are, or New York, which are, pretty good numbers at this stage, although as everything opens up, all the numbers get skewed. So one of the things that I like to think about is not this binary, but and as I advise companies is is how are you balancing this? And this could be true for your family too, or just how you think about your life, like, and admittedly, sometimes we can be irrational in terms of their risk calculation. But this is how I think about it. Okay, so there's three things that you're trying to do when you want a safe and slow, emphasis on slow reopening. You want to first minimize contact intensity. As you said, Patty, it's so important that we know so much more about the virus. Like, are you washing your groceries anymore? No. I mean, we now know that, right, how it spreads. And that is contact intensity. It's not contact. Very rare that I pass someone on the street, 6 feet away and I would get it. It is a certain kind of contact, and that is bars and gyms and sports and all the stuff that we shouldn't be doing because they exist for contact intensity, right? So, okay, so that's the first thing you want to minimize. So it means that if you are a company and you're thinking of reopening, you're going to want to focus on those areas that have increased contact intensity, either the elevator, open office space, or a cafeteria, right? Okay, so not every space is the same. The second is you want to manage the number of contacts. This is now a numbers game. We have mass community spread. Testing and tracing is only going to take us so far because we lost our capacity to be able to have a rigorous tracing system. So basically, this is just, if I'm sick, better that I'm only around 5 people than around 50 or 500, and vice versa. If I'm not sick, better. So this is why you want to, and some states have laws now, only 20 or 30% capacity. You have to have, think about pods in terms of how people are working together. So if one person is infected, that they haven't been with any more than 8 other people. For companies that are larger, think about your senior staff. Do you actually want them all in at the same time? Because you don't, this is a little bit like continuity of operations when you're in government. You don't want all your entire C-suite ill at the same time. So thinking about how the number of contacts and then who's in that contact group. So that's some of the creative thinking that we're seeing. And then the third is you want to maximize mitigation policies, both personal and institutional. That is cleaning, masking, socially distanced, getting, having plastic around cubicles. But I want to take a step back from this and just, begin with the primary question. What are you losing by not returning? Right? Is this right? Yeah. What are you What are you losing by not returning?
Right.
And is it outweighed by what you're gaining by keeping people apart? This is just a simple question. So when people say, "How do I open?" When companies say, I say, "Why? Why? What are you losing?" So there's lots of industries where that answer is obvious. I'm retail, I'm a restaurant, I'm whatever. I get that. But for you and me, teaching, consulting, advising, why? And if you cannot answer the why, keep them home. I don't get it. You're exposing your employees. We don't know what the laws are like in terms of liability. If you need employer insurance, we don't know what that's going to look like. Like, why?
Mm-hmm. So why take the risk?
Why take the risk? You're not, I mean, one of my columns for The Atlantic, they titled it rather aggressively, and I was kind of annoyed. And then I thought, you know what, that is what I'm saying. Like, you're never returning back to the office. Never is a long time, but it's indefinite. If you can, and figure out other ways to replace what you're missing.
Right. So, we have a lot of people watching this right now online, and I wanted to say to everybody, I am certain that you have a lot of questions for Juliette. Please put them in the comments as you're watching, and we will have a Q&A section a little bit later. But start putting your questions for Juliette in, or thinking about them. Okay, so there are, many of the workers that were deemed essential workers during this pandemic are low-wage workers with poor benefits, farm workers, grocery and convenience store workers, domestic care workers. Some companies were good about recognizing the really important role that they play in our ecosystem, especially because they're putting themselves at greater risk of catching COVID-19 while they were working, and provided, things like short-term premium pay. But now that this pandemic has gone on, I think probably longer than many of us anticipated, maybe not the health experts, but many of the rest of us. Do you think we're going to have a different conversation or a different awareness in the future about what type of work is valued and how that work is compensated? Like, is this a moment when we can actually relook at some of that?
I think so. I hope so, but I also think so. So, here's the bad news, and then here's the good news. So the bad news is that a crisis, and this is true of every crisis, a crisis finds a nation, a community, a city as it is not how we want it to be. So we are, right. So we are, a crisis is a mirror to what's crappy, right? No, not universal health care, racial inequalities, women and work, right? All the stuff, right? As women leave the workforce because they can't do this, right? That's the data that I saw that you guys have been looking at. So at this moment, I think we are in triage, right? But I do think that, and part of this is just what does the political landscape look like? What's our tolerance for the number of deaths that we're likely to have, which is, some respectable modeling shows it at 400,000 by the end of January, is that's when the safety nets, we begin to talk about that stuff as we did after the New Deal. And so I do think there's an opportunity where there's two areas where I think that's going to be most noticeable. And we actually could have done this time around, because we definitely have the legal authority, we being the federal government, is to deem critical infrastructure employees, which includes food. It includes almost every of the areas that you talked about, food, transportation, anyone in a critical infrastructure industry, to have protected them, not just in terms of economics, but in terms of they are essentially frontline. They're essentially, first responders. And this is what was so amazing to me is, crisis management 101 is, if you lose your first responders, you lose your disaster response, right? You always protect the first responders. And that may mean that you go slower, that things don't move as fast. But if you lose them, you lose everyone. The fact that we put healthcare workers at risk, let alone transportation and others. So we had the legal capacity to do this before, just like the Defense Production Act, it was just never invoked. The second area where I think we need a rethink of critical infrastructure is obviously in education. Schools are clearly in disaster management. When we talk about critical infrastructure, what does that mean? It means that it's an industry that if it goes down, the capacity to recover is limited. And education is not in that list, right? So food, transportation, water, electricity, all that stuff is in that, are in those formal lists. Education is not. It is clear not just because it's daycare, as some people who do not have children would want us to believe. It is because education, if our kids are not being taught, we've lost a generation of kids, and we probably already have lost a lot of kids. So, so we should put education or educational services, K through 12 at least, into that, so that we put more focus on resources for teachers as well as students. But this is not sustainable. I mean, and the rage of the, as I like to say, the rage mom has replaced the soccer mom. Right. And dad, I will give dads can have their own spokesperson. I'm just going to speak for the moms.
That'll be your next book, Rage Mom.
Yeah, exactly. The Rage Mom. And as I said, we have every comfort in the world. And if we find this hard, Right.
Exactly. Where are the areas that are where are the areas where we can catch up, where the country could catch up versus the areas where it's too late to catch up?
Yeah. So I think, unfortunately, I think it's too late in terms of the calendar. I think that, just the summer should have been the best time. Fall and winter are going to be harder. So I do think that we just need to essentially extend our runway. But there are lots of things that we can catch up on. We can get better with supply chains, that we're delivering stuff better. And I think we have. I think some of those early challenges have been fixed to a certain extent. We are getting better with regionalization simply because of the absence of a federal government. So you're seeing a lot of this, a lot of governors band together to lower the price. But where I think the private sector has been most interesting, and this is some of the data I've been following and monitoring. So when it was clear there's going to be no federal plan, a bunch of us, basically were, one state, one city at a time, but also one industry. I do think, if you look at the closures in March, a lot of those happened in the private sector well before the public sector was willing to do it. So if you look at Twitter, for example, or the NBA, if you think of any night that changed the way the American public thought about the pandemic, it would have been the night that, I think it was a Saturday night, that the NBA shut down completely the season, and Rita Wilson and Tom Hanks said that they were sick. That night, I remember just watching TV. I think I was in studio just watching TV and thinking something has changed, right? And but that was led by the private sector. You think about, so I think that where we can get ahead is to have the corporations set the baseline that the federal government has not been willing to do, whether that's masking, which you're seeing with the major retailers, and that's not likely to change. Uber and transportation, no mask, no ride, which is, really important. The social distancing or the no, the no presence of sports. I think all of that is where the corporations can push a floor that we're not seeing from the federal government. So that's when people say, how come you're not cocooned under a bed? I said, because you're just seeing tremendous amount of ingenuity, one with states that some are doing well, and cities certainly. So to make people happy, or to give them a little bit of optimism, despite what Trump tried to do with the masking culture wars, right? And if you watch too much TV, you would think it is a war. So in the most recent NPR NewsHour polling, 80% of Americans want, now get the wording, mandatory. That's not, Biden's not even there on mandatory masking ordinances, 80%. So this culture war is being fought by such a small percentage. We shouldn't be afraid of them. And then here's the better one. This is what I monitor, is 76% of Americans are living under a masking mandate, a statewide masking mandate. Already. So you would think that it was 50-50 if you watch the news already, including 50 of the 50 most populous cities. So they're not all the same, and enforcement's weird. But if you just think one of government's responsibilities is to set a floor of what appropriate conduct is, like seatbelt laws or anti-smoking laws, we're getting there, one damn state at a time, but we are getting there. So those are the kinds of things where I think the public sector, the private sector amplifying that, right, mirroring that good behavior becomes really important. So honestly, like if anyone's from the airline industry, I love Delta. I mean, I don't actually fly Delta very often. Delta has put 130 people on a permanent no-fly list for the airline. For masking. I love them for that.
Wow.
That there's proper conduct and improper conduct, and the Delta has said no second chances. You know how to behave. That's the kind of thing that we need to see from corporations. It's an unforgiveness, right? We're done now. We're done. We're 200,000 dead. There's like no dilly-dallying anymore.
Right. Exactly. So what do you think workplaces are going to look like post-COVID?
Yeah. So that means
will open offices still be?
So I think it's important that people see this. So my one of my colleagues who I work a lot with, who some of you may have seen on TV as well, he has maybe the best time booked ever. His book on healthy buildings came out in March of this year.
Nice.
We put together a slide that he lets me use. We often do things together. So Joe Allen. So let's put up that slide because I think it's a really helpful way so that people don't think. I mean, when we talk about social distancing, we should be talking about smart distancing, right? In other words, the social distancing, everyone gets in their head, it's March and everything's gloomy. And so he really thinks about this in 5 stages. And what's interesting is PPE's last. So this sort of mirrors my triangle, is that, you have to really think about the hierarchy of control. So first is eliminate the hazard. Default should be, if you can work from home, work from home. It keeps you off, as I said, it keeps you off roads. It keeps you from bringing something back to your family. The second is substitution. So you are going to have to be thinking about, and this is what we do in continuity of operations in government.
Mm-hmm.
What are your core features that need to be in the office? It doesn't have to do with hierarchy of title. Just who, does your IT staff need to be in the office and your non-IT staff? No. So thinking about what that substitution is. The third is, of course, engineering controls, which is what is known now in the field as healthy buildings. That's all the stuff we're talking about now: higher ventilation, enhanced filtration, air purifiers, cleaning protocols, all that sort of physical stuff. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now this begins to look manageable. Keep most people at home. Who needs to come home now? I mean, who needs to come into work now? What have we done at work? What have we done in the building? Then it's administrative goals of those people who are going to come in. How are they working, right? So do you have, do you have your cubicles covered? Can they work in shifts? So you now have 7 to 2 and then 2 to 9. And some people may prefer that because they do have kids at home, what's called red, white, and blue days, different teams coming in. This is totally doable. I mean, it just takes a good modeling by someone. And then surprisingly, the fifth is, okay, now that we've decided some will come in, the building's clean, they're going to come in phases. How are they coming in? And that's things like masking, period. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a solvable problem. I like to say about COVID, however dire things are, the one good thing is we know exactly, it requires only 2 things. It wants a new healthy target, victim, and it demands respect. And we failed in the second, right? We just sort of, as a nation. And this is one way to respect the virus, that we actually know how it spreads. And that should give us, as someone, if you run a company, that should give you some confidence that you can do this, knowing that the default should be, if you cannot answer the why am I bringing them back? Think again why you're asking the question.
Yep. Right. Yeah, exactly. So, okay. So how long do you think that this part lasts, right? Yeah. Are there parts of our work life that are probably never going to go back to what they were like pre-COVID, like even after there's a vaccine, even after people get vaccinated?
I mean, so some of them are good. And some of them are really good for work-life balance. So, and then I want to do the bad part. So so let's assume this is good. Or at the end of this, so a vaccine. So some is going to be, so all of this, everything from telemedicine to telework, we all this sort of flirtation that we had done with it over the last 10 years, we basically, married, divorced, married again, over the, I don't know about you, it's like enough already, but like, we're here and we are, and it's working. I mean, all the data I've seen is for white collar jobs, productivity is the same, relatively the same, if not better. There's downsides. We have to figure out ways on a personal level how we divide the space. My husband and I actually have gotten into a habit of after dinner. Our kids are older, so we have later dinners. But like the summer, like we take the dog for a long walk because we just found like the work to dinner often ended up being back to work. And we were just like, this is not working for us and stuff. So we try to sort of divide the evening in some way and get out and honestly get out of the house. So figuring out those ways. So I think that might be good. That might be good for suburban living. It might be good for transportation, for the climate. But there are lots of there's downsides that we have to be cognizant of. One is that the impact of those who do have to work is substantially impacting minority communities, just given the nature of work. And that is something that we have to be cognizant of, so we don't have sort of the people going in are people of color, the people who get to stay home.
Exactly.
Right. So one of these is just access to other jobs. I think or access to job diversity. I think if we don't get to this point, if we don't get schools open, this luxury is not really a luxury. So the data that we're starting to see on women leaving the workforce, because is real. And they are missing the best years of their life in many ways. I mean, their career life in many ways, because the kids are young and they've gotten off of the track. I think for women who stay in and keep working, I wonder what our productivity is like. I mean, I know I'm very efficient, but I don't, it will have an impact. I think the third area that we're testing, and I'm definitely testing this as a faculty member, as a professor, is this one thing, you have the Raben Group, you guys all know each other, You've known each other for years, your family knows each other. Okay, now you're apart. And then maybe every once in a while you get to meet up in someone's backyard and say hi to each other. The onboarding issue is, it's going to be very, very different. And how do you create culture when you've never met someone, right? Now you can meet them maybe outside or whatever. And what will that mean for a generation that's onboarding in terms of their commitment to the institution, right? Someone that you've hired, do they really feel like they work for something called the Raben Group, or are they just working for Patty via Zoom? And what will that mean for institutional identity for a company? And I think these are all open questions. I think they're all manageable, but they're just ones that we have to be cognizant of.
Well, and it seems like there's, as you mentioned before, there's an equity piece to that as well, right? Because not only do you want to make sure that your most frontline positions, the people who are going to have to come in every day, are not all people of color, and management and leadership positions are all filled by people who are white, who are working from home. But when you're hiring, when you're onboarding, I would imagine that those equity considerations come in there too, right? To make sure that everyone feels welcome and like they're on more of a level playing field.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, and that's going to take a corporate culture that is very, very sensitive sensitive to where people live, their own, their own backgrounds. I mean, you know the story of why I'm in a new background, right? I mean, it's hard to work like this, but our internet crashed. The system finally crashed in the Kayyem Barron household, and so I'm in my son's room rather than my office. Things like that are going to happen. People's access, but I think that's exactly right. And when you think about how do people get jobs, we're going to have to be very, very cognizant of not defaulting to the norm or the familiar. If you take the parallel reckoning that, and a rightful one, that this country is going through now with Black Lives Matter and racial inequities and racial injustice, I think was long overdue. But I tend to think it was not a coincidence that it aligned with COVID, because of, as I said, a crisis exposes a mirror, and we sometimes don't like what we see, both in terms of its impact on communities, but also in the sense that something was fundamentally wrong with American government. That the idea that institutions were reliable, either for COVID or racial justice, just know, like, you can't convince my kids of that. You just can't. I mean, maybe I'm traditional and still have faith. My kids, no way.
Right.
No, I mean, they look at government and they're like, why do you have so much confidence in it? It's like, well, because I've seen it work. But they're in, they're coming of age during COVID and racial injustice, and they're not seeing that. So I think it's really important that as elders, that we see that in a generation that's coming into the workforce. Yeah,
exactly. Which may make them more skeptical of workplaces. I want to remind folks, I see a couple of questions coming in, but I want to remind folks, if you have questions for Juliette, please drop them in, so we can have her answer them later. If you have concerns about your own workplace, or questions about what the future of work is going to look like, please drop them in. So I read the statistic the other day from Edelman, an Edelman survey, that only half of employees believe that their offices are safe now.
Yeah.
And building off of what you just said, it seems like there's a trust issue here, right? That not only are companies going to have to make workplaces safe, but they're also going to have to figure out how to get employees to trust that they're safe, right?
Yes. So this is not dissimilar to what's happening in just the economy as well. And so we've had some good numbers on unemployment, and I think that's great. I think that the numbers that remain are going to be the most stubborn, and because those are industries that one might call the sort of the confidence gap, or the what I call the confidence gap, which is they're confidence industries, ones in which there's interaction is high. So restaurants, movie theaters, entertainment industry, sporting, all that. Those are going to be jobs that are hard to come back, because the very nature of them is inconsistent with a global pandemic. In Europe, which is doing much better than us, and there's a talking point going around about, Europe is in bad shape. Europe is nowhere close to us. In fact, they're monitoring these outbreaks that you're seeing in Europe are because they are monitoring them, right? You would expect to see some of these outbreaks. Europe calls it the empty table economy, which is that they opened up, but the people were still sufficiently scarred by the fear, especially like in Italy, that it was very hard for them to come back. So public leadership, governors, mayors can do a lot by going slow. That we found that the data shows that while the noise on cable may be open, that the American public is far behind, and is much more patient than the 24-hour news cycle. So that's good in the sense of, so for employers who may feel some internal pressure to reopen, your employees are probably not there. And so you should actually find out what your employees are thinking. It's a lot like faculty at universities, right? They don't necessarily want to go back. So how do you fill that confidence gap? So one is, this is something that hopefully a lot of employers have been doing, and or managers, is, the first is really communication. What was your battle rhythm during COVID in terms of communication to your employees? And are you sustaining that, right? Do you have a listening tour going on to determine what they actually want? You may have employees who want to go back because they find this not conducive, and they have a spouse that works at home, or you might or a huge proportion do not. So part of it is just, that confidence is built by people having a sense that you are taking into account their own risk calculation. And once again, as I said, as we extend the runway, right, a flat curve is a longer curve, just warning everyone. And as we wait for a vaccine, the risk calculation may be different. So you need to take that risk calculation over time. So just like what I was saying, in March and April, if you said, will you get on an airplane? The answer is no. I have not seen my parents who are in their 80s in California since December. So ask me that question now, and I'm much closer to yes. Now, yeah. I know I read all the data. Airplanes are safe, whatever. It's just, we each have our thing, right? And so for me, it was flying. And I think that risk calculation has changed for me.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So how do we rebuild that trust? This could be an entire other segment, but how do we rebuild that trust in government? Also, to keep us safe?
Yeah, I think I do think this is where politics come into play, because it's very hard for us to map out 2021 without knowing who the president is going to be. But there's some reassuring data out there still. So for the vast majority of American publics, in the 70%, still wary of the president and still wary of the media, which is enough, but still very trustworthy of their local governments, as well as the medical and health professionals. So I think it's really so what you're seeing with the vaccine and the pushback by the medical and health community and the FDA, the pushback on the FDA by the FDA against all the whispering at the White House, is really important, because the American public still has confidence in those audiences. And that's good. And then I think, you rebuild it. I mean, one way, and I work with a lot of mayors and governors, is that they fill the vacuum, and you try to just sort of, rid yourself of the background noise, right? It's not even background noise, but just sort of the madness, right? I mean, I think, the best line I've ever heard, a Democratic candidate say, I think, was Michael Bennet, who said, which was just so perfect, which is, I promise you that if I become president, you won't think about me for weeks on end. And I was like, oh my God, that's what I want. Right. So, that's a way to think about rebuilding. And I do think, because we talk about rebuilding confidence, this is where the pressure, but also the opportunity on management, on senior management and CEOs, is really, really strong, that they need to create that battle rhythm. They need to have communication. So in the early days, I was advising some of my clients, especially major retailers, they needed an email out every day. They, and they got creative. They would, interview an employee and put a video up about how crappy this was, right? People want to feel like leadership is experiencing it. I'm not even responsible for anything. I just have a public voice in this. But the line that everyone took to in my most recent column was when I admit that, my children are horrified by the emission, but I run now to Luther Vandross, because it's the only thing that sort of makes me feel gets me out of the sort of the rawness of living in a pandemic, that you don't really feel anything. And so, and people want to know that you relate to them.
Yeah. No, exactly. I also feel like we should just ask for a no tweeting pledge.
Yeah, by a president. Yeah.
All candidates.
I think that for any candidates, right, exactly.
I want to go to a question that we have from somebody about disabilities. How do you feel the new normal could affect job opportunities for the disabled? Do you think more employers will now be willing to hire those that might require accommodations? I have one thing to add to this, which is, are there other pieces of this that will be better or worse for people with disabilities?
Yeah. So I think there's going to be some things that are better, because, and I don't mean to justify the discrimination that exists in people's minds, but if people continue to work remotely, accessibility issues become very different, because for the most, it may be that people with disabilities or living with disabilities have made accommodations in their home. So I think in some ways this may be opportunities in many regards, in the same way that I think that this is true for, as I was talking about earlier, sort of a racial recognition about the way we live. Clarity and realism as well, to the same extent. So how do I put this? So crisis management and crisis response tends to think in bulk. It's not intimate. And so, how do you address 80% of the population rather than 20%, right? And so I think that there has been a lack of focus of both the impact this has had on people with disabilities, and how do we make things better for them. And so, part of what people like me try to do is learn about how can we think outside of bulk, right? So the, I can come off as sort of crude, or not crude, but just like, you're just trying to fix a problem, right? So now that we're in the long haul, now begin to think about how can we address some of these questions. And I do think that there are opportunities. This has been one of the challenges between the public safety community and the public health community in the COVID response, because I do think the public health community is better on these issues. Yeah. And I think my community is not, and I'm just willing to admit that.
Well, as we see different, measures being put into place, I definitely have not seen much of a conversation on the effect of those measures on people who are disabled. For example, I was in an elevator the other day where you don't have to press any buttons. It just automatically stops at every floor. Yeah. That's what they instituted. Yeah. And I thought, well, I'm going to stop at every floor. And also, if I couldn't push buttons, this is actually an okay solution, right? But other things, like having to clean your desk, or just all of the procedures that you have to go through, or even, we were talking about before this chat, about the ecosystem that is necessary, right, to get to and from work. Right. Like, if you are reliant on public transportation, then public transportation also has to be safe. And it also has to be safe in a way that works for people who are differently abled.
Exactly. That is exactly right. And this is why I don't think we're there yet. When you talk about the ecosystem, for one, is the ecosystem ready? Yes, public transportation, there's not a lot of evidence that this stuff, that people are getting sick by being on a bus if they're masked and sitting seats away and stuff. But just every exposure is a vulnerability, and that's and maybe more so for people with disabilities or have other needs. And so I just, if you had asked me in March, can you do an event in September for us about what's happening? I kind of saw what was happening in March, but I don't think that I would have said then I need 6 more months. And I think I would be hard pressed to recommend to one of my clients that they return to anything remotely normal. I went through the 5. Yes, have some people have them return on alternate days, but for the most part, we figured out a perfect example. I'm not in my office, but CNN is not. I'm an on-air analyst for CNN. CNN has said publicly they are not returning people to their very expensive new headquarters at Hudson Yards until early 2022. So think about. Yeah. So think about that's what I've seen publicly. I've seen that. I hope I've seen that. But Uber has said,
you have now.
Google has said 2022, there's sort of writing, giving themselves a lot of time. But just think about I digress a little bit, but I do think about the price point also on stuff like this. So when I used to be on CNN, because I'm not in New York or DC, they used to have to rent out a studio, get a makeup person, and get a car. That's a couple $1,000s for a single hit. They sent me a $200 package, right, of nice gizmos that are in my home office. Their whole financial calculation is now different as well for contributors like me. I'm now much cheaper from their perspective than I had been. And so there's calculations that go well beyond safety and security that are going to probably keep us at home as well.
Right. That's a great point. So we have a really good question about onboarding. Yeah. That's with respect to onboarding and the difficulties of creating culture in this environment. Do you have any advice for those who are being onboarded virtually, particularly recent grads, which, my heart goes out to you as a recent grad.
Yeah. So first of all, congratulations on getting a job.
Yeah.
Let's not, and I have a college age student who decided to just take a year off, and she just got an internship. I know how hard it is. So some of it begins from your perch and some of it begins from the employer's perch. So for employers, let me begin. So we do know what works and what doesn't work. And some of it is just everything that you used to do before multiplied by 4. So in other words, the reach outs, the mentorship, the do they have a point of contact that's taking care of them? Is that person communicating with them? Multiply by 4. Need to do that 4 times as often as you had before, because you're not running into people in the hallway. Second, the things that create corporate culture can continue in many ways. So all hands meetings, T-shirts, happy hours can still continue. My law firm, I have a company, my law firm for my company, it sounds kind of intense, and you and I know how intense corporate lawyers can be. They do a boot camp like every morning for lawyers, if any of the lawyers that want to. It sounds like hell, but nonetheless, there are ways to create that. There are ways to utilize Zoom or whatever platform that you're on that are less formalized than Zoom, including, music and breakout rooms and how you bring it and polling and stuff. So all of that sort of consistency of touch, then multiplied it by 4. Multiply, because you're not seeing these people. On the onboarding side, if you're the young person, so a couple things that I would recommend that are just, from the perspective of management is, one, you're out of sight, out of mind. So you need to make yourself present in ways that not are like cocky, especially for women. Don't think it's cocky. What are you doing? What, let people know what you're doing during the day. Engage in all of those meetings. Ask to go to meetings that you're hearing about, because in some ways it's less awkward, because if you're just a face on Zoom, it's not like you're a body in a room and stuff. And engage that way. You also might ask your onboarding, whether you have an HR or if it's a smaller place like the Raben Group, maybe you have just a person who hires you, to more formalize a mentor-mentee relationship. That can feel very awkward to be like, oh, will you be my mentor? But because we're not seeing each other. The third is, and I get this with students, is, I am more than happy to have you, come to my backyard and chat for half an hour. I really am, because I've been in this chair, since, 8 o'clock this morning. And so, one thing that you might do is also make yourself physically accessible. You got to take the cue from the person about their comfort level, but we've got 2 months of good weather. Well, I'm in New England. You guys in DC, you have more, in which you should try to, do the things that are totally permissible to do, so that you can have some physical contact, because you have to think about December, January, and February.
Right. So which are going to be very isolating months.
Yeah. And I think, but everything times 4. I mean, that's, as a faculty member, that's basically, if I communicated with my class as a class, we have a platform called Canvas, in which we communicate with our students, the syllabus and stuff. If I used to send maybe 1 or 2 notes a week in between classes, I'm now doing 5 or 6. Like I am, because the isolation is something that makes people not feel like they're committed to the institution. And I know, I've been with an institution a long time. You've been with an institution a long time. There's a generation a lot younger than us that may not have those institutional affiliations, but the institutions need them to have it.
That's right.
We need people to commit, right?
Yeah. We've got a great question that brings together everything for you, Juliette, all your expertise. So there's a lot of stories out there about how companies are monitoring their work from home teams. And just, can you talk about the role of surveillance and privacy?
Yeah.
I know this has been a love of yours for a long time.
Right. And it's probably not the greatest of news. I mean, I think it's important. And part of it is just like going to be, what kind of, if you work for a company of 30,000 is very different than if you work for, I don't know how big the Raben Group is, for 30.
We're like 80 people now.
How many?
We're about 80.
What?
I know.
I'm so happy for you.
That's known us from the beginning.
Like, do you have an HR department now? Are you like real? Are you like grown up? Oh my God. Anyway, that's awesome. So, okay. So I'm going to not use you as an example, but, okay. So the first is from the employer-employee perspective. There are rules and laws that you are governed by depending on what state you're in. Are you allowed to record? Are you allowed to save? This is what you're hearing from teachers and Zoom. They don't want recordings, and sometimes it violates, without consent, it violates state or local laws. So what are your ground lines? And employers better know this before they start demanding it, because this, as I said, the law is unclear. Liability is unclear right now. If I'm a lawyer or if I'm an insurance company advising you, I am telling you to do the most cautious thing, right? So which is don't bump up against the law. So you want to have what the ground rules are, and to state them explicitly, right? I think for people who are under union contracts or others in which there are known work hours and not work hours, to demand the protection of those non-work hours in terms of where you are on computer or what your activities are. I tend to find that one can, as someone who hires a lot of people, you can judge someone's productivity without monitoring them minute by minute, right? I mean, if you have a good management system, you know exactly what's going on. So for smaller places or law firms or whatever else, you're already doing that. If someone is working for clients. So I think given the challenges of privacy and division of labor and home right now, unless you are an employer that for some reason would need to monitor for reasons that are not at all clear to me, that the downsides outweigh the good sides, I would refrain from it, because I think honestly, as your lawyer, I think the liability issues are just not clear right now.
Right.
Let me give a good example. Let me just give you a good. Yeah. Or so people say, God, you're so insistent on working from home. Like other people are going into work. Here's why the 4 largest insurance companies in the United States of America have instituted work from home through half of at least 2021. When your insurance companies are working from home, they are taking a risk calculation. They know what their liability is. So I just want to make that clear. So I'm thinking
they're the experts on that.
Exactly. They really are doing the actuary tables. So it's just something for people to know. Like you might get a sense everyone's opening up. It's like actually industry, think about your law firm. I mean, the law firms that represent us. My law firm is still remote, and some people go in because they have kids, but it's like at 15%.
Right. All right. I think we have time for like 2 more questions. Brian has a question. Do you believe that the new normal will have a potentially lasting detrimental impact on society and the workforce as a whole in comparison to the way we interacted pre-COVID?
So hi, Brian. That's such a great question. And as I said, great things have happened to nations that have faced failures like this. And so, but a lot of it is aligned with the political discourse. So honestly, it's really hard for me to answer that question, because I do believe it's aligned with, what is our political infrastructure looking like? And so that's why, at the risk of sounding political, I do think that this election does mean a lot. But I do think, I think that there's going to be some real reckonings in a good way, in particular about education. In particular, I think about women and work. I think, there's no way to, honestly, there's no way to talk about this without sounding like you're complaining about your husband or your partner. And I don't mean to. It's just, I do think that if you just look at the data, it's the impact is just falling on women. We're either working women or stay-at-home moms in ways that are not equal. And then, of course, on the race issues that I think that are aligned with this, both in terms of its impact on those communities. And so, yes, I do think there will be changes for the better, but those are political changes. So we need to be cognizant of what the politics look like as well.
Right. Okay, two very fast questions. One is, are companies going to need new positions focused on health, like the chief health officer? And the second is, are handshakes ever coming back?
So yes and no. So there are aspects. Let me go to the second one. There are aspects to our physical interactions that are probably permanently changed, and that will be even with a vaccine. So I do think some of the things like handshaking, anonymous hugs, all that stuff. I think the way that we'll be served food will change. I think gloving and masking will be sufficiently normal. Like, in other words, and I know that's hard to believe, but imagine how weird a mask was for you in April. And now think how nude you feel now. So for companies, especially larger ones, you are seeing the rise on the first question of the CHO, the chief health officer. I think it's really important because it's not just this pandemic, it's going to be others, but it's actually viewing public health as within the safety and security apparatus has always been a challenge. All the global public health and people will tell you they've always been ignored by the national security apparatus until now, right? Now all of a sudden everyone is a pandemic expert, but you couldn't. There wasn't a lot of national security or homeland security activity around pandemics. I think and so what you want to do, or how you want to think about it, is for companies, and I don't know how large some of the audience are, but think of a law firm that's giving advice or consult. So you have a security apparatus. In the last 5 years, that security apparatus probably got divided in ways that I don't like between the sort of chief security officer, which is physical, and then the CISO, which is the cyber. And a lot of times I find I don't like that division because, come on, what cyber attack isn't going to have, physical consequences? Right. What active shooter case isn't going to, need your network not to falter, right? So you saw then in between the two, then you saw the rise of the chief trust officer that was overseeing both of them. So trust and preparedness. You're going to have to fit in a chief health officer, but you need to fit, because I do think things like who's in charge of remote offices that may be in places that are experiencing outbreaks. If 2 of your employees get sick at a franchise, is it 2 or 10 that closes down the franchise? There's just questions. There's tactical questions that have to be answered. It can't be answered by anyone but someone who's monitoring what's happening, especially for big companies. And so, but you want to integrate that person, this was me last night, just like you don't want security sort of sitting off on the side, as too often we saw in the pre-9/11 world. You need to integrate the chief health officer into your business planning. It's just the way it has to be, because that's the thing that's going to shut you down in the same way as cyber attack would shut you down. So as I said, you don't create a little kids table with all your little security people talking to themselves about how no one listens to them. You have to actually bring all these people into the sort of, the connective tissue of the company. I think we've learned that the hard way. But I do, and with I do think that the leadership of companies and the private sector, and lawyers and insurers, that, they've pushed us better in some ways than our federal government, and they just have to continue to do so.
Yeah. Well, and it's all like we were talking about earlier, it's all an ecosystem. Yeah. Exactly.
So wear a damn mask. And I'll end with that.
Yes, wear a mask.
Yeah.
Juliette, this has been really, it's hard. It's weird to say this for a panel about COVID, but it's been delightful to talk to you.
We're still allowed to have some joy and delight in our
lives. We
lives.
are still allowed to have some joy. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. It was incredible. I learned a ton. I know our viewers learned a ton, and just so appreciate that you are in the world doing this work and helping to keep us safe. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you guys for everything you do, and we'll talk soon.
Yes.
Okay, good. Talk to you later. Bye.